There's a big difference between leading an SG team into the field and being responsible for the entire program, for everyone on base, and in a way, for the whole planet. Approving missions, making impossible decisions on the spot, navigating tricky politics, writing reports, sending people into danger, and justifying those decisions to the president himself, these are the jobs of the people who stay mostly in the background. But without them, nothing would work. Earth and Atlantis would have been enslaved or destroyed long ago. When you hear the words Commander and Stargate, the first person that comes to mind is probably Hammond of Texas. And that's absolutely fair. Few did more for the SGC than he did. Hammond was a soldier and a general through and through, but he was also a deeply human figure. He commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. He had authority, but he never focused it on others. That's not to say he couldn't assert himself. He certainly knew how to stand his ground. He went toe-to-toe with senators, presidents, even the Pentagon itself, but always with calm and dignity. Hammond wasn't flashy or extroverted. He was steady. Like a lighthouse, he was a constant, reliable presence when everyone else was lost. People liked working under him, they respected him, and in many ways, he was more than just a commanding officer. To some, he was a friend, or even a father figure. We've known him as leader since the very first episode, discounting 1969. And his character didn't really change much over time, because from the start, he was already competent and doing things the right way. He had very few flaws, rarely made mistakes, and when he did, he wasn't afraid to admit them and change his mind. He protected SG-1, maybe even a bit too much, but I believe he was just as fair to everyone else under his command. He rarely went into the field, but when he did, he never hesitated. If it meant saving his people, he'd be right there on the front lines. And whenever he showed up in a crisis, it changed the tone completely. That's when you knew things were serious, and everyone had to give their all. Not just the soldiers, but the general himself. In the series, Hammond died of a heart attack. Although this was never shown on screen, the audience only learned about it through a conversation between Carter and Sheppard. This was because the actor who played Hammond unfortunately passed away from a heart attack in real life, and the writers included it in the story as a tribute, naming a battleship after him. Originally, that ship was going to be called Phoenix. General Landry had a tough job. He was stepping into the shoes of a legend, and while he was clearly an experienced general and he knew how to command, he didn't always have the natural authority that Hammond had. Hammond could speak quietly and still have every word carry weight. Landry was more traditionally military, direct, sometimes to the point of being blunt. He wasn't a bad leader by any means, but I'm not sure people followed him because he had that innate presence. Maybe it was more about his rank. At times, his reactions felt like he was past his prime, like the sharpness of his mind had dulled with age. He often came across more like a father figure than a commanding one. And to be fair, he joined the SGC at a time when it had grown into a big organization, rather than the tight-knit group of world-saving scientists it had been in the early seasons. Naturally, the vibe had shifted, and of course, nostalgia plays a role. We remember Hammond as part of the good old days. In many ways, Landry was the most classic general of them all. Tough, straightforward, but fair. He wasn't the most memorable character, but he was the guy holding it all together when it counted. Of course, you could argue that Landry wasn't really replacing Hammond, but rather O'Neill, and technically that's true. But to me, when we talk about the SGC generals, Hammond and Landry are the first names that come to mind. It's not that O'Neill didn't do a good job, but his time as a general at SGC was pretty short, and the actor couldn't spend as much time filming by then, which really showed. Looking at his leadership style, O'Neill definitely brought something unique to the role. He was never a bureaucrat. It took him several seasons to even realize he had a desk at SGC. He constantly poked fun at authority, and never really appeared to move up the chain of command. When they offered him the promotion, he wasn't even sure he wanted it. He spent most of his time in the field, and now he was supposed to sit behind a desk? That was probably a bit terrifying for him, given how little experience he had with that kind of work. But he knew his people. Politics annoyed him, sure, but he could read between the lines. And more importantly, he was smart enough to admit when he didn't understand something. He had no ego getting in the way of asking for help. His leadership style was unconventional, but it worked. And in the end, no one blew up the planet. So, mission accomplished. Where the mission almost wasn't accomplished was under the command of General Bauer. He appeared only briefly, but left quite an impression, and not exactly a positive one. He was the textbook example of a hardliner from Washington, coming in to show everyone how he was going to grab the place by the throat, without any real understanding of what was going on. Like when a company hires a manager who's kind of an idiot, but feels they need to prove themselves at all costs. His ego is definitely a problem. Knack with a bomb experiments? Check. Ignoring the scientists' warnings? Check. Bauer ran the SGC for just one episode and nearly turned it into the last episode of the entire series. But of course, that was the writer's intentions, to show a stark contrast to Hammond. He was a clear example of what happens when someone leads the SGC seeing the Stargate as only a weapon of war, rather than a path to knowledge. He came fast, left faster, and thank God for that. Before we jump to Atlantis, there's one more honourable mention, General West. He appeared in the original Stargate movie and is now something of a forgotten figure, mostly remembered by die-hard fans. But he was there at the very beginning of the program. He was supposed to be that old, hard-nosed, no-nonsense military man who didn't sugarcoat anything. West was old school. Order, discipline, results, no matter the cost. But to be fair, he never had much screen time to develop his character, so there's not much to compare. One person who did have plenty of time though was Elizabeth Weir, a completely different kind of leader. A civilian, a diplomat, an academic. She wasn't running a military base, she was leading an international expedition in another galaxy. Her greatest strength was her ability to make decisions quickly, to negotiate, and to bring together people from different cultures. She was highly empathetic and always tried to see things from all sides, even the enemies. While Hammond knew when to let the team go and when to say no, Weir often tried to find a compromise, sometimes for too long. She wasn't weak, but her leadership style was less direct and more collective. At times, it felt like she wanted to hold a vote rather than decide herself, and that didn't always work. Still, she handled her role in an extremely difficult environment with strength. Weir was the voice of reason in a team full of soldiers. She wasn't afraid to say no, even when everyone looked at her like she'd lost her mind. And that's why she earned their respect. She didn't need a weapon, she had character. Then there's Richard Woolsey, a category of his own. At first, he came in as a bureaucrat, an inspector, someone nobody wanted in their office, let alone in the command chair. In some episodes, he was practically a villain, conducting investigations against our heroes, and his character was never really meant to be likable. But when push came to shove, it turned out Woolsey wasn't a bad person, just a bureaucrat to the core. Someone who believed in structure and the rule of law. He'd already begun evolving even before arriving in Atlantis. As we saw in SG-1, he could choose the right side when his moral compass pointed him there. And once he was in the Pegasus Galaxy, much like Rodney McKay, Woolsey went through a major transformation. From a paper leader who assessed risks with spreadsheets, he became a real leader who learned that the human element sometimes mattered more than rules or regulations. Respect didn't come naturally to him. It wasn't immediate or automatic like it was for Hammond. Woolsey had to earn it. And that's what made him so compelling. Hammond was a great leader from the start. Woolsey became one over time. That transformation from pencil-pushing bureaucrat to respected and beloved commander was what made his character arc so impressive. When we talk about Atlantis, we obviously can't skip over Carter. She led the city for only a short time, but it was still fascinating to watch. She was the kind of person who never asked for command. It was entrusted to her because she was more than qualified. Samantha fulfilled her duties as a captain, major, and colonel impeccably. She saved the world more times than anyone could count. So it only made sense to make use of her abilities in a leadership role once she was no longer the right age to be flipping over Jaffa in the field. Despite her immense and objectively undeniable contributions, she never let it go to her head. In fact, she sometimes even seemed to doubt herself. She never carried herself with the same level of certainty as the other leaders. Out of everyone mentioned so far, I'd say her authority and overall command presence might have been the weakest. She functioned well in small teams and under pressure, and I think that's the kind of person who makes a great team leader for a close-knit group, but not necessarily a strong manager overseeing an entire base with little supervision above her. Still, somehow she made it work. People respected her, partly because of her legendary history as one of Earth's greatest heroes, and partly due to her knowledge and competence. She wasn't the kind of leader who yelled, "Forward!" She was the one who went first. That's also why I think she would have been a better fit for a smaller team, a research station, or just like she eventually got, a spaceship. As commander of the Phoenix, or rather the George Hammond, she really came into her own. That felt like a much better match for her. Another, let's say, honorary leader of Atlantis was John Sheppard. He was, using air quotes here, only the military commander of the expedition, not the commanding officer in the traditional sense. But he had it rough. When he left Earth, he wasn't expecting to be the top-ranking officer. Command basically fell into his lap. Sure, he nudged things in that direction a bit by shooting his superior officer, but, well, we know how that went. As a major, he led the military side of the expedition for the entire first year, all under the assumption that he might never see Earth again. With no contact with Stargate Command, no one to turn to, no help or guidance, he was thrown in at the deep end and he had to learn to swim fast. Later, once they re-established communication with Earth, his leadership and accomplishments were officially recognized, and Sheppard was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and kept command of the city. This time, it was official. Not that it hadn't been before, but that time it was just under the mantle as the highest ranking officer after the Colonel's death. The idea was once that they reconnected with Earth, someone more experienced would replace him. And that did happen when the first wave of Marines arrived, led by Colonel Everett. But we'll get to him. John's leadership style was informal, sarcastic, and kind of lazy at times. He was like a younger version of O'Neill, though Jack, while he hated paperwork and loved mocking authority, always got the job done. When a report needed writing or a form needed filling out, he did it, and he did it right. John? Well, he could be a bit sloppy. He definitely wasn't a Hammond type leader, with systems, discipline, and a clear command structure. Sheppard was more of a wild card, but the kind you could count on when it really mattered. And that's what counts. I would have loved to see Sheppard and Hammond interact. Honestly, I believe Hammond would have given him a good old-fashioned Texas-style dressing down more than once. But in the end, he would have acknowledged John's value. Maybe Sheppard would have even picked up a bit more responsibility along the way. And since we're talking about all of them, let's talk about all of them. Everett Young is probably the most straightforward soldier of all the leaders we've seen. Out of the whole bunch, he came closest to what it means to be a commander in a military conflict. Tough, closed off, constantly exhausted. On board the Destiny, he faced non-stop stress, isolation, mutiny, and loss. His situation was very different from the others. Maybe the stakes weren't quite as high as in SG-1, where the whole world was on the brink of destruction every Monday, or in Atlantis, where the fate of the whole galaxy was often in the balance. But for people on that ship, it definitely felt like everything was at stake, their very lives. While the others commanded stable teams in well-equipped bases, Young was leading a nightmare scenario. His crew weren't the best of the best, hand-picked, highly trained operatives. They were literally just whoever happened to be there. Civilians, politicians, the current staff of the Icarus base, and anyone else who'd wandered by. Most of them were completely unprepared for the challenges ahead, and Young was expected to lead them all. As if that wasn't enough, the second most powerful person on board was a maniac and a psychopath who was constantly scheming against him, and Young couldn't get rid of him because without his knowledge, they wouldn't have gotten far at all. Everyone on the ship had their own opinion, and usually it clashed with Young's. A total leadership nightmare, commanding a crew that basically didn't want you there. Young's leadership style was rough, sometimes even harsh, but he was no tyrant, and I always felt he treated people fairly. Where another leader might have called a meeting, Young would just tell someone to go to hell and push forward. In the end, he managed to find his own rhythm in the chaos. He came to understand his ragtag group and stood at its head. Over time, even those who were initially against him came to respect him. Whatever his flaws, at the end of the day, he always put the welfare of the crew first, and slowly but surely, they came to understand that. So now, if we look beyond the top tier leaders, there are others still worth mentioning. First up is Colonel Sumner, the first military commander of the Atlantis expedition. He was supposed to lead the whole thing, and he was ready for it. A classic soldier, always expecting danger around every corner. He was tough, outspoken, and knew how to give orders. His men respected him. He thought in straight lines, not very imaginative. But that was probably intentional to create contrast with Sheppard, who was friendly, curious, and much more relaxed. Sumner was killed by the Wraith Queen in the very first episode, so we didn't get to learn much about his style, but he never felt like a character who was meant to stick around. The writers clearly wanted someone the audience would root for so John could come in and win them over. Another interesting commander was Colonel Everett, who led the military reinforcements to Atlantis in the siege. He had that classic, I'm in charge now, no discussion vibe, and he was very good at it. But his style didn't really fit the expedition to the Pegasus galaxy. He didn't know the people or the environment, and his approach, orders only, end of story, clashed with a team that relied heavily on collaboration. He struck me as the kind of leader who's afraid to admit that he doesn't know something, or when someone else has a better idea. And that, to me, is the worst kind of leader, because if you're confident in your own value and authority, you shouldn't have any problems listening to others and using their ideas when they're better. Everett didn't have much time to bond with the team or to recognize their strengths. Like Sumner, he only lasted a two-parter in Atlantis, and in his case, I kind of wish we'd seen more. He seemed like the kind of person who could learn to admit when he was wrong, and if he'd had more time to get to know the team, he might have really grown into the role. In any case, one thing's for sure, there's no one single right way to lead. Sometimes it takes calm like Hammond. Other times it takes sarcasm, maybe diplomacy, or even raw honest grit. But all of them had one thing in common. When things got tough, people knew they could count on them. And for us viewers, the beauty was in the variety. Each one of them was a well-written character, completely different from the others, which made it all the more compelling to watch. So who was your favorite commander? For me, it's probably a tie between Hammond and Weir. Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks very much for hanging out with us, and we'll see you in the next one.